here. Thank you also online for coming to the conference. Yes, my title is a little bit grand, actually, Managing Infinity, but it's based on a little observation I had in my own teaching career, really, which is when I started teaching, living in Germany and then in Italy, the big problem we had was the sparsity of good material that we'd use with our students. We had the course book, a dictionary, one or other things, maybe a novel you could use, but fundamentally, now looking back, it was pretty limited. Now we've got the opposite situation where we have an infinite array of material, very often free, if not free, at least quite easily available, etc. So the whole talk is based on that little observation and how maybe we should deal with it. So in other words, I'm hoping we can talk about this choice that we had and how we can deal with choice. But this choice is not just some wonderful sweet shop where we can choose any candy we want to. It's a choice which is within a very complex environment, and maybe a more complex environment than I had 20, 30 years ago when I started, 35 years ago, when I started teaching, where we had certain exams like Cambridge First Certificate, the well-known. The road was fairly clear, fairly clearly outlined for us. Now there are so many roads we can take and our students can take, but there's a great complexity there. The complexity also is linguistic, as we'll see in a moment. I also want to suggest a few solutions. Solutions, it's a big word, suggestions for what we might be able to do to deal with this challenging environment. I say challenging, I don't mean that in a negative way. In some ways, it's so much better than it was when I was starting out teaching 30 years ago. I remember the worst thing that used to happen to me in my first year or two of teaching was when a student would come up to me, very respectfully, a good student, and she or he would say, "This is my favorite song," and she'd hand me a cassette. Say, "Can you tell me the words to the song, please?" And I knew I had 3 or 4 hours of pressing the play, scribbling down a few words, pressing again, most of the time not hearing clearly what was sung, because in British and American pop music, the enunciation is not particularly clear. It was a really big job, and you wanted to do it because the student was keen and was learning, but the facility was so limited that it took a long time. And even at the end, you didn't feel you had all the lyrics correct. Now it's completely opposite. You can go on the internet and find at least a version of the lyrics to your favorite song very quickly. So things have really changed. So these are my aims. The last thing I want to mention, when you have these big choices, you have a complex environment, I think you also need to develop discernment, the ability to choose, to critically analyze, and to make informed decisions rather than kind of just drown, being overpowered and overwhelmed. Okay, this is all in the context of what we might call post-digital awareness. When I say post-digital, I don't mean after digital. Post-digital refers to the humanization of digital technology and making it something that we can like, we can feel comfortable with. We saw pictures of the cats a few months ago. I couldn't tell they were generated by AI. The thing is, those cats looked like photographs. So they looked analog, even though they were probably digitally generated by AI, etc. In other words, post-digital environments are environments that are fundamentally humanized in some way, which makes them more enjoyable, but maybe a bit more dangerous or frightening as well, that we can think about. In this environment, we need to be aware of various things. First of all, course technology is also always available. We might have the rule that you have to turn your smartphone off at the start of the lesson. We might not, it depends. A lot of teachers now like to use smartphones as a really rich resource in the class. Point is, the technology is there, we can't really deny it, it's available. I think we also need to embrace social media as teachers. I don't really like social media. In fact, the phrase anti-social media appeals to me more, but I think we have to embrace it because that's what a lot of students will be using English. We have to be aware of that as a context. We need to help our students to use effectively, etc. We also, it means that we're going to have lots of hybrid learning context. We need to be aware of the facilities that are available or imposed upon us maybe as well. Every time you get any social change, there is technical change, there will be a social change. And the social change might be really big. This is what our speaker was just mentioning at the end, talking about this AI universe and what a big universe is. The social changes potentially are huge. Ironically, even for a technology which is just mimicking us. And yet somehow mimicking us so well that it's changing the whole of our society potentially. It means that maybe the motivation for our students could be really changed. It's maybe positive, but we need to be aware of. And I think the new post-digital world will be plurilinguistic much more than in the past. The idea of a single global language is now rather old-fashioned. I think we can suggest that with translation devices, etc., we can coexist with lots of languages in a way we didn't imagine 30 or 40 years ago. There are some dangers here, and I think we need to be aware of them. And they're normally divided into two different kind of threats. The primary threats of social media, internet, etc., are things like people taking your identity, so cybercrime, hacking, and of course cyberbullying, etc. Those are very direct threats that maybe we can police or limit to some extent, and we expect people like Facebook or whatever to police them, and we criticize them when they don't do it well enough. But there are secondary threats too, which are maybe more profound and which we as teachers need to be aware of. The first thing I mentioned here is social disinhibition. We do stuff online we would never, ever do in real life. And of course, it is real life now. I always say to my students, would you go to the centre of Ferrara and take your clothes off? Well, no, of course you wouldn't. Well, actually, that's what people sometimes do online when they send a photograph. And if you do it in the centre of Ferrara for 5 minutes, a few people might see you, somebody might take a photo. If you do it online, it can go anywhere. We know the dangers involved with this. So this disinhibition is a real danger that we as teachers need to be aware of, etc. I think linguistically we can mediate this and we can work on it, etc. Of course, there are dangers of injustice as well, maybe injustice of access to various things. This ChatGPT is free, and most of these AI programs are free at the moment. Probably eventually some very good ones will be costly, and the cheaper ones will be less updated, less effective. We need to think about that. We need to be aware of it, etc. I think we have a really big part to play in this. The European Union is very keen on this, and our students being social agents, not just language students. And the two I think go together very well. This is where we then start to connect with technology, and maybe we as language teachers can help our students to navigate this difficult world. Okay, we have to make a choice. There's lots of materials available in this very complex world we're living in. We have to make choices. Choices are really important, of course, because they're very practical. Each day when I plan my lesson, I think what activities I want to do with the students, what things I want them to learn, etc. So the choice in a very practical sense. But there's also an idea that whatever your method or your approach is, will somehow make the choices for you. I think that's a rather old-fashioned idea. I think now we are pretty eclectic anyway, most of us as teachers, and we take things from various methodologies or theories, etc. But also there's so much material out there, it's unlikely that you will always be using things that fit in with a certain methodology or whatever. In other words, we'll probably be a bit broader than we were, even in our methodological assumptions, etc. But also this idea of choosing is fundamental to being a teacher. Actually, what we do is in a limited time we have, very often it's a 30-hour course, 60-hour course in the classroom, and we know classroom time is absolute gold. It's the most valuable thing. Of course, we can set tasks, we can encourage all sorts of extracurricular learning, but the fact is that it's class time that we value as teachers, which means we need to choose very well what we do in class. Of course, that's a problem because we have this huge array of materials of text. Text is almost infinite, and being reproduced and then increased all the time. As I say, also lots of audio, lots of videos. There are lots of things we can choose between, which means we have a huge choice every time we go into a lesson or a plan, of course. And I say it's different from my experience 30 years ago, etc. Also, at the same time, the channels of communication are more complex. We used to have the 4 skills, and we were pretty comfortable with those 4 skills. I was never happy because we didn't have translation, which is the 5th skill, in my opinion. I think there should be 5 skills in basic language teaching theory. But having said that, also now we really need to have an extra kind of view of the interactive skills we need using computer technology or digital technology. So we need to be able to write the kind of email that won't offend people and get what we want. We need to be able to use social media and multimedia channels effectively. So when you want to put an Instagram post on that is funny but not offensive, you need to understand the interplay of the image and the phrase you use and the references that are being called into question each time. So we have these choices, they're complex choices. We as teachers are facing them, but our students as well. I think we should let our students in on our thinking when we make the choices, because that will train them to be more aware of the way you can make choices, etc. The problem is, with a huge array of choice, there's a feeling you might get disorientated, you might feel disempowered, and then eventually you might disengage from the whole process. Or what I tend to do, I keep in my comfort zone. I use the kind of technology I feel most comfortable with. I really think that's fine. And you can use that maybe quite effectively, but you're not really making a proactive choice of what's the best thing we can do next, etc. Okay, when we're talking about dealing with this choice, what can we do? Well, I think, first of all, teacher training courses should have clear work on how to make choices as to what material to use, what technological supports to use, what apps to use, etc., etc. So there's a clear rationale for the choices you make. It's a life skill to make choices. That's why I want to involve our students in our decision making. one of the best questions we can ask our students at the end of an activity or an exercise is, why do we do that? And if you ask your students, most of the students are embarrassed by the question. They expect you to know why. But also, they're not familiar with saying, hey, what's that like that? What's the point in that? If you show your thinking, you let the students in on your rationale, hopefully they're more motivating because they'll feel that there's more value in what they're doing, they'll appreciate the value. They'll understand where you're coming from and they'll probably respect your thinking on the matter. It's much more likely motivating, etc. At the same time, every choice we make in a classroom is highly meaningful. We know if we decide to get angry or not with a student, that's a super meaningful moment and emotionally very important. But all the choices we make are full of significance. I mentioned Aristotle here. You know, Aristotle and his theory of drama, of tragic drama, the idea is not what you describe the person as being. That's pretty irrelevant according to Aristotle. We understand what a character is like by the things that he or she does, by being faced with dilemmas and making choices. So when Macbeth decides to follow his wife's advice and do the murders, etc., he does. That's when we understand what Macbeth is like as a person, and we make judgments about that. In the same way, when we're teaching, I think students are going to make judgments on us, depending on the choices we make. They'll certainly decide on what they think about the lesson with the choices that are made, etc. I'm going very fast because I'm a bit worried about time, so I do apologize. I'm doing it too quickly. If you can actually be confident in your choices, if your rationale is clear, that will empower rather than disempower you. Whereas if you suddenly got all these choices, you think, well, I'll choose that one, because you didn't know what to do, that, of course, is not an empowering choice. You feel vulnerable straight away. And that's important to recognize. Remember, affect is the most important thing in learning and teaching. And with AI, which is fantastic, I do that to indicate the talk we just had. AI is fantastic in so many ways. But as was indicated in the talk, maybe the affective element, the human element, is what we should really be concentrating on, and we can develop. Also, it's worth mentioning that language itself helps us to make choices. It allows us to elaborate the thinking involved, to describe the question, the dilemma, what it is, and to then say have a rationale for our choice. Language itself is intrinsically a part of making an informed choice. So as language teachers, we're involved exactly in this. Okay, it's pretty complicated for us because language itself has got more complicated. I mentioned how the 4 skills are not really enough. One of the really big differences is the idea of speaking and listening as being one part of skills and reading and writing being the other, so spoken and written dichotomy is very, very inadequate for use of language nowadays. There's so many forms and channels of language use are highly kind of hybrid in being both spoken and written. Even an email, we tend to write it more like we were speaking to the person, compared to a letter in the old days was highly formalized and had its strict grammatical structures to make things clear, etc. So the problem is that we're dealing with a complex, very rich world of choices and a much more complex linguistic environment we're trying to prepare our students to live successfully within. Also, at the same time, maybe grammar is not quite as obvious as it was, and given as it was. Should British English somehow be a model of grammar? Well, that's open to question, etc. And as I mentioned here, we should be teaching our students digital communication skills, and that means understanding the pragmatics of virtual interaction rather than the pragmatics we're familiar with. Okay, moving on very quickly. That means we've got various tasks we have to face up to, one of which I think the language we're teaching will be less transactional in the future and more interested in how you present your identity, maintain your identity, maybe even defend your identity. That's a real linguistic skill. The phraseology you use really can influence how people perceive you, etc. We need to help our students in presenting their identity, maybe online and maybe even when they're speaking. But this skill of identity in a liquid society we live in, where it's a performance at all times to indicate or reaffirm what you are as a person, is something we need to really work on in languages. Language is where this really happens most of all. Yes, you can look beautiful and dress well, etc., but language is one of the real ways you can improve your way of representing yourself in the world, etc. That means we need to be very skillful in our use of language. We also need to understand how to avoid misunderstandings. We need to be skilled in that, and we all know, of course, with emails, it's notorious how easily people can misunderstand you, etc. And as social agents, we should be able to do this with skill. Okay, a few solutions, very quickly, in a few minutes, a few solutions. We're going to use AI. It's been mentioned next door quite a lot. AI is going to offer us so much more text, but we can make this text much more personal, much more simple for our class, for our moment. The secret is to localize AI, which is generalized in principle. That's where we come in. We're the mediators. Teachers have always been mediators. And we can really take pivotal role here in mediating this huge magic machine that can produce any language we want to produce the language we really need, we really want, etc. One of the most useful things there can be getting ChatGPT or the equivalent to answer a first certificate writing question 5 times or 6 times, and getting the students to compare them and see which one they think is better and why it's better. Get them to really express what is better about the second answer compared to the first, etc., etc. And all sorts of interesting things come out, especially at the discourse level. You find the discourse level, that's where ChatGPT falls down, which you mentioned a moment ago with things like irony, etc., etc. This is one area we can really get into. I'm running out of time, so I'll be very quick. I've got 1 minute left, I presume, yes. There are lots more solutions I've thrown out here. They're really for discussion. Do remember that translation is now really effective. We laughed at Google Translate about 7 or 8 years ago. DeepL, which I've looked at a few times, is remarkably effective. Yes, there are things to correct, and again, they become pivotal in spotting the huge errors there are sometimes. But overall, it produces pretty effective translation, super fast. 50% of translators, professional translators, use DeepL or Google when they translate, and then they correct that. 50% of professional translators. I personally wouldn't, because I only translate occasionally. Normally is a favor for a friend. But if you're a professional translator and time is important, that's interesting. This is the beginning. Remember the motor car in 1910, how terrible it was compared to motor cars today in terms of reliability, etc. Things do get much more effective. I'm completely running out of time. I'm going to slip through my solutions. I do apologize. But I want to mention teacher training as being fundamental. So teachers have the tools to understand the choices they're making and to share that with students, as I say. Training, as I mentioned, interestingly, I mentioned exactly what was said next door. That when you pay for a massive amount of new technology as a company or a school, you're a fool if you don't double that on the money you spend in training. It's absolutely fundamental. It's funny that I should have mentioned the same thing I just mentioned next door. If two of us are saying it, maybe it's true, but there we are, we'll see. Anyway, a few more solutions here very quickly. The last thing I want to mention is in this glut of information, what we really need is discernment, critical understanding. That's really tricky and it's very hard to assess and to test, but it's a fundamental life skill and a language skill we should be working on. Discernment is something we should be giving our students as a skill that we possibly can, and we need to think of ways of doing it. I'm going to have to stop there, I think. So final thoughts very quickly. What we need to do is to get our students to engage really deeply. We need to reflect on why we're making the choices we're making, get the students to reflect on why we're using AI or why we aren't using AI, why we use Kahoot or not. Kahoot's great fun, but is it really worth doing in the classroom? Is there something linguistic that's happening that's valuable? Is it re-elaborating our information to make it more complex and therefore more memorable? We need to think what we're doing. And most importantly of all this technology should be additive, not subtractive. Somebody once famously said, when did the candle stop being used? The candle is still used. Imagine a birthday cake with bulbs on it. It'd be rubbish. Candles have their purpose. We didn't lose candles by inventing electric lights. It's additive. We can gain more from these things. So we don't forget the skills of the past, but we maybe readapt them and develop them for the future. And most importantly of all, we should always be aware of cognitively what we're doing. When we use this technology or these choices, we're doing it because cognitively we hope something is happening, both for ourselves as teachers and as the class, and maybe the community together. Something memorable, something complex is happening in the classroom. And that'll stop.